The blood on Margaret's hands wouldn't wash away no matter how hard she scrubbed. And it wasn't even real blood, just berry juice from the pies she'd been making all morning. But standing there in the back room of the Platteville, Colorado General Store where she worked, she felt the familiar panic rising in her chest like floodwater. It was April of 1882, and she'd been in this mountain town for 3 months now, running from a past that followed her like a shadow. And the dance social planned for Saturday night had everyone talking except her, because dancing meant being seen, being touched, being vulnerable. And Margaret Sutton had sworn she'd never be vulnerable again. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped back into the store where Mrs. Henderson was arranging bolts of calico fabric. The older woman glanced up with kind eyes that held too much knowing. "You'll come to the social on Saturday, won't you, dear? The whole town will be there." Margaret's throat tightened. "I don't dance, Mrs. Henderson. Never learned how. It's easy enough to learn. Any young man would be happy to teach you." That was exactly what Margaret feared. She mumbled something about needing to check inventory in the stockroom and escaped before Mrs. Henderson could press further. The dim stockroom smelled of wood and dried goods, and she leaned against a barrel of flour, willing her heartbeat to slow. She was 22 years old and felt ancient, worn down by memories she couldn't share with anyone in this town that had welcomed her with open arms and no questions asked. The bell above the shop door jingled, and she heard Mrs. Henderson's cheerful greeting followed by a man's deep voice that carried a warmth like sunshine through wood. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson. I'm looking for some supplies. Heading up to the mine for a few weeks. Lucas Irving. I haven't seen you in town for a month." "Where have you been keeping yourself?" "Out at the ranch mostly. My brother's got me working every daylight hour, but I needed a break. Thought I'd try my hand at prospecting up in the high country." Margaret peered through the gap in the stockroom door. The man called Lucas Irving stood at the counter, hat in his hands, sandy brown hair catching the light from the window. He was tall and lean with the build of someone who worked hard for his living, probably in his mid-20s, and when he smiled at Mrs. Henderson, his whole face transformed with genuine kindness that made Margaret's chest ache with an emotion she couldn't name. "You'll be back for the dance social on Saturday, won't you?" Mrs. Henderson asked, and Margaret felt her stomach drop. Lucas laughed, a sound like creek water over smooth stones. "I suppose I could delay heading out until Sunday. Been a while since I've had a chance to dance." "Wonderful. And perhaps you could do me a favor. We have a new girl working here, Margaret Sutton, lovely thing but terribly shy. She says she doesn't know how to dance. Perhaps you could teach her a step or two." Margaret's face burned hot with embarrassment and something close to anger. She didn't want to be anyone's charity case, didn't want to be noticed or helped or drawn into the community's warm embrace because that embrace could turn into a cage so easily. "I'd be happy to if the lady is willing," Lucas said, and his voice held no mockery, just simple courtesy. "Margaret." Mrs. Henderson called, "Come out here, dear." There was no escape. Margaret smoothed her dark blue skirt, tucked a strand of brown hair behind her ear, and stepped into the main room with her eyes fixed on the floorboards. She could feel Lucas Irving's gaze on her, patient and curious rather than demanding. "Margaret, this is Lucas Irving. He's offered to teach you to dance at the social. Isn't that kind?" Margaret forced herself to look up. Lucas had gray eyes the color of storm clouds, and when they met hers, she saw something unexpected, a recognition of pain that matched her own. He'd been hurt too, she realized. Maybe not in the same way, but he understood what it meant to carry wounds that didn't show. "That's kind of you, Mr. Irving," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I really can't dance. I'm not comfortable with it." "Can't and won't are different things," he said gently without pushing. "But either way, I respect your choice, Miss Sutton. No pressure from me." The fact that he gave her an escape rather than pressing his advantage made her look at him more carefully. He had an honest face, weathered by sun and wind, with smile lines around his eyes that suggested he laughed often. His clothes were worn but clean, and he held himself with a quiet confidence that seemed rooted in knowing who he was rather than proving anything to anyone else. "I'll just get your supplies together," Mrs. Henderson said, moving toward the shelves. "Margaret, help me gather these items, will you?" For the next 20 minutes, Margaret focused on collecting the flour, coffee, bacon, and other provisions Lucas needed for his prospecting trip. She was acutely aware of his presence, the way he moved easily around the store, the low murmur of his voice as he chatted with Mrs. Henderson about the weather and the mine prospects and his brother's new foal. He had a way of making conversation feel natural, like water flowing downhill, and despite herself, Margaret felt some of the tightness in her shoulders ease. When everything was bundled and ready, Lucas paid and tipped his hat to both women. "Thank you kindly, ladies. Miss Sutton, I hope you change your mind about the dance. Not for my sake, but for yours. This is a good town with good people. They'd like to know you." After he left, the store felt dimmer somehow. Margaret returned to her work, but her mind kept drifting to those gray eyes and the unexpected gentleness in his voice. Mrs. Henderson hummed as she worked, and Margaret knew the older woman was pleased with herself for the introduction. That evening, Margaret walked back to the boarding house where she rented a small room on the second floor. Platteville sat in a valley with mountains rising on all sides, their peaks still white with snow, even though spring had arrived in the lowlands. The town was small but prosperous, sustained by the nearby silver mines and the ranches that sprawled across the grasslands to the east. Margaret had chosen it precisely because it was small enough to disappear into but large enough to support a general store that needed help. She'd come from Kansas, from a farm where her father's temper had been as unpredictable as prairie storms and twice as dangerous. After her mother died when Margaret was 15, there had been no buffer between her and his rage. She'd endured for 7 years, waiting until she came of age and could legally leave, saving every penny she could hide. When she finally ran at 22, she'd taken nothing but her mother's silver locket and the clothes on her back. In Platteville, she'd found work and safety, but she'd also found loneliness. She kept everyone at arm's length, terrified that if they got too close, they'd see the damage inside her, the broken places that might never heal. The thought of dancing, of being held by a man even in the respectable framework of a social dance, made her skin crawl with memories of her father's grip on her arm, bruising and cruel. But Lucas Irving's eyes had been kind. That was the thing that kept circling through her mind as she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind whistle through the eaves. His eyes had been kind, and he'd respected her refusal without making her feel foolish for it. The next few days passed in their usual routine. Margaret worked at the store, measuring out yards of fabric, weighing sugar and flour, helping customers find what they needed. She was good at the work because it required accuracy and patience rather than social graces. Mrs. Henderson trusted her to handle the accounts and manage inventory, and Margaret took pride in keeping everything organized and balanced. On Friday evening, Mrs. Henderson approached her with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you, dear. Don't argue, just accept it." Inside was a dress, a beautiful spring dress in pale green cotton with tiny white flowers printed on the fabric. The style was simple but flattering, with a modest neckline and sleeves that would fall just below the elbow. Margaret's eyes stung with unexpected tears. Mrs. "Henderson, I can't accept this. It's too much." "Nonsense. I had the fabric sitting around, and Mrs. Chen is the best seamstress in town. She was happy to have the work. You'll wear it tomorrow night." "I haven't changed my mind about the dance," Margaret protested weakly, even as she held the dress against herself, feeling the soft cotton against her work-roughened hands. "Then wear it for yourself. Wear it because you're a young woman who deserves pretty things. Wear it because spring is here and life is short, and joy is precious wherever we can find it." Margaret didn't argue further. That night, she tried on the dress in her small room, standing before the cracked mirror on her dresser. The woman who looked back at her seemed younger somehow, softer, with hopeful eyes that she barely recognized. She touched the fabric, smoothed it over her hips, and for just a moment allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to dance, to spin and laugh without fear. Saturday arrived bright and clear, the kind of April day that promised summer without delivering its heat. The social was scheduled to begin at 7 in the evening, held in the town hall, which doubled as a church on Sundays, and a meeting space the rest of the week. All day, Margaret wrestled with her decision. She could stay in her room, safe and isolated, or she could venture out and risk the terrifying possibility of connection. At 6:30, she put on the green dress. Her hands shook as she buttoned it, but she forced herself to complete each small task. Dress, hair pinned up in a simple style, her mother's locket around her neck, a shawl in case the evening turned cold. She looked at herself one final time in the mirror and whispered, "You can do this. You don't have to dance. You can just go and watch." The walk to the town hall took only 10 minutes, but each step felt like a mile. She could hear music already, a fiddle and guitar playing a lively tune that made her heart race with anxiety rather than excitement. Lights spilled from the windows, and through them, she could see people already dancing, spinning and laughing in ways that seemed to belong to a different species than her own solitary existence. She almost turned back. Her feet actually began to carry her away when a voice stopped her. "Miss Sutton." "Is that you?" Lucas Irving stood near the entrance, clearly having just arrived himself. He wore clean trousers and a white shirt with a vest, his hair neatly combed, and when he saw her in the lamplight, something shifted in his expression, a recognition that went deeper than mere appreciation of her appearance. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and because there was no artifice in his voice, she believed he meant it. "Thank you," she managed. "I wasn't sure I'd come." "I'm glad you did. Would you like to go in together?" "I don't know about you, but I always find these things easier when I have someone to walk in with." It was a kindness, giving her his arm and making it seem like she was doing him a favor rather than accepting charity. Margaret hesitated only a moment before placing her hand lightly on his sleeve. His arm was solid beneath the fabric, warm and steady, and he matched his pace to hers as they climbed the steps. Inside, the town hall had been transformed. Someone had strung paper lanterns across the ceiling, and the lamp light caught them, making the whole room glow with warm color. Tables along one wall held food and punch, and at the far end, 3 musicians played with enthusiasm that compensated for any lack of professional polish. At least 40 people filled the space, more than Margaret had realized lived in Platteville, all of them dressed in their finest, all of them smiling and moving with the unself-conscious joy of a community that knew how to celebrate together. Mrs. Henderson spotted them immediately and bustled over, her face alight with satisfaction. "Don't you both look wonderful? Margaret, that dress is perfect on you. Lucas, you'll take care of our girl, won't you?" Before either of them could respond, she was gone, swept up in greeting other arrivals. Lucas looked down at Margaret with a wry smile. "She's a force of nature, that one." She's been very kind to me, Margaret said, defensive of the woman who'd given her work and asked no uncomfortable questions. She's kind to everyone. It's her gift. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. Would you like some punch? We could stand over by the refreshments and watch for a while. No pressure to dance unless you want to. Relief flooded through her. Yes, thank you. I'd like that. They made their way to the refreshment table where Lucas filled 2 cups with punch from the large bowl. It was sweet and cold, flavored with berries and mint, and Margaret sipped it gratefully, using the cup as something to do with her hands. From their position against the wall, they could watch the dancers without being in the middle of the activity. The music was lively, and couples spun across the floor in patterns that seemed chaotic, but were actually carefully choreographed. Margaret recognized some of the people from the store. Mrs. Chen, the seamstress, dancing with her husband. The blacksmith swinging his daughter around until she shrieked with laughter. Young couples courting under the watchful eyes of their parents. Everyone seemed to know the steps, moving together like a flock of birds that knew instinctively when to turn. It looks complicated, she murmured, not realizing she'd spoken aloud until Lucas responded. It's not as hard as it seems. Most of these dances follow the same basic patterns. Once you learn a few steps, you can adapt them to almost any tune. Did someone teach you? She asked, curious despite herself. His expression grew distant for a moment. My mother. She loved to dance. She'd make my father push back all the furniture in the parlor, and she'd teach my brother and me the proper steps. Said no son of hers would grow up unable to dance with his wife at their wedding. His voice caught slightly on the words, and Margaret understood that his mother was gone. I'm sorry, she said softly. Cholera epidemic 5 years back. Took her in half the town where we lived before we came here. My father followed 6 months later. I think his heart just gave up. Lucas took a drink of punch, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the dancers. My brother and I bought the ranch here to start fresh. Sometimes starting over is the only way to keep living. Margaret understood that better than he knew. She wanted to tell him about Kansas, about running, about the fear that still woke her in the night, but the words stuck in her throat the way they always did. Instead, she said, Your mother sounds like she was a wonderful woman. She was. She used to say that dancing was proof that life could be beautiful even when things were hard, that moving together in rhythm was its own kind of prayer. He looked down at Margaret and his eyes were gentle. I think she was right. But I also think everyone gets to find their own way to pray, their own way to find beauty. You don't have to dance if it doesn't feel right to you. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and couples moved together in a simpler pattern, swaying more than spinning. Margaret watched a young couple, probably newly married, holding each other with such tenderness that her heart ached. The woman's head rested on the man's shoulder, and he looked down at her like she was the only person in the world. What does it feel like? Margaret asked before she could stop herself. To dance like that with someone. Lucas considered the question seriously. It feels like trust, like you're both agreeing to move together, to listen to the same music and let it guide you. The man leads, but only because someone has to, not because he's better or more important. The woman follows, but she's the one who makes it look beautiful, who adds the grace. It only works if both people are willing to be vulnerable, to make mistakes and keep going anyway. Trust, vulnerability. The very things Margaret had sworn never to risk again. But watching the dancers, seeing the joy on their faces, something in her chest loosened just a fraction. I don't know if I can do that, can't or won't. Lucas asked again, echoing their first conversation, but this time there was a challenge in his voice, gentle but real. I'm afraid, she admitted, the words barely audible over the music, of dancing. Or of what dancing represents. She looked up at him, startled by his perceptiveness. "How did you know?" "Because I was afraid too after my parents died. Afraid to plant roots, afraid to care about anything because caring meant risking loss. My brother practically dragged me to the first social after we moved here. I stood against the wall the whole night, convinced I didn't belong, convinced I'd forgotten how to be part of a community." He smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of hard-won peace. "But then Mrs. Chen asked me to dance, told me her husband was feeling poorly and she didn't want to sit out the whole evening. And I realized that sometimes courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing the thing anyway, because the alternative is letting fear write the whole story of your life." Margaret's pulse hammered in her throat. The music played on, the dancers swirled, and Lucas Irving stood beside her with patience written in every line of his body, not pushing, just waiting. She thought about her room at the boarding house, small and safe and terribly lonely. She thought about her father's anger, how it had stolen so many years from her already. She thought about Lucas's mother dancing in her parlor, insisting that beauty mattered even in hard times. "I can't dance," she said, hearing the tremor in her own voice. "I've never learned. I'd step on your feet, I'd look foolish, I'd ruin it." Lucas set down his punch cup and turned to face her fully. He held out his hand, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. "Then let me teach you. We'll stay right here, away from everyone else. I'll show you the basic steps, and if you hate it, we stop. But Margaret, what if you don't hate it? What if this is the first step toward writing a new story?" She stared at his outstretched hand, calloused from ranch work, steady and strong and waiting. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to retreat, to maintain the walls that had kept her safe. But safe wasn't the same as living, and some part of her, buried deep beneath the fear, wanted desperately to live. "Just the basic steps," she whispered. "Here, where it's quiet." His smile could have lit the whole valley. "Just the basic steps, I promise." She placed her hand in his, and the touch sent electricity through her entire body. Her first instinct was to pull away, but Lucas's grip was gentle, respectful, nothing like the bruising hold she remembered. He positioned her other hand on his shoulder, his own hand coming to rest lightly at her waist, maintaining a proper distance. "The waltz is the easiest to start with," he said, his voice low and calm. "It's just a box step, really. I'll go backward as you come forward. Ready? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. He began to move slowly, patiently, counting the beats aloud. Margaret tried to follow, but her feet tangled with his and she stumbled. Panic flared hot in her chest, but Lucas simply steadied her and smiled. "That's normal. Everyone stumbles at first. Let's try again. Don't look at your feet, look at me. Trust that I won't let you fall. Trust." There was that word again. Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes, to focus on his face rather than her fear. They began again, and this time she made it through several steps before losing the rhythm. But Lucas just kept counting, kept moving, kept holding her with that careful gentleness that felt safe rather than threatening. Gradually, impossibly, her body began to understand the pattern. 1, 2, 3. Forward, side, together. The music from the main floor seemed to align with their movement, and she realized they were actually dancing. In their quiet corner away from the crowd, they were dancing together. "You're doing it," Lucas said, and the pride in his voice made her chest swell with something that felt dangerously close to hope. "You're dancing, Margaret." "I'm dancing," she repeated, amazed. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside, unexpected and bright. "I'm actually dancing." They continued for several more minutes, Lucas gradually adding small variations. A gentle turn, a slight dip, always telegraphing the movement so she could prepare. And Margaret, who had been so certain she could never do this, found herself not just following but beginning to anticipate, beginning to feel the music in her bones and let it guide her movements. When the song ended, they stood still, hands still joined, slightly breathless. Margaret realized she was smiling, truly smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for what she felt. "Thank you for being patient with me." "Thank you for trusting me," he replied. "That took real courage." Before either could say more, Mrs. Henderson appeared at Margaret's elbow, beaming. "I saw you two dancing. Oh, Margaret, I knew you could do it. You must come join the others on the main floor now." The fear returned in a rush. Dancing with Lucas in their quiet corner was one thing. Dancing in front of the whole town was something else entirely. She must have paled because Lucas squeezed her hand gently. "We don't have to. We can stay right here." But Mrs. Henderson was already tugging her toward the dance floor, and other townspeople were turning to look, smiling with encouragement rather than judgment. Margaret felt trapped, exposed, all the old panic rising like bile. She pulled her hand from Lucas's grip and took a step back, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, I can't. I thought I could, but I can't," she gasped. And before anyone could respond, she was pushing through the crowd, past concerned faces and reaching hands, out the door into the cool April night. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to grassland. Her breath came in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with the brief run and everything to do with the terror that filled her lungs. Stupid, stupid, stupid. She'd let herself hope, let herself believe for a moment that she could be normal, could be part of things, and look what happened. She'd made a scene, embarrassed Lucas and Mrs. Henderson, proved that she was exactly as broken as she'd always known herself to be. Footsteps approached from behind, calm and unhurried. She knew without looking that it was Lucas. Part of her wanted to run further, but exhaustion kept her rooted in place. He came to stand beside her, not touching, just present. "I'm sorry," she said to the darkness. "I ruined the evening." "You didn't ruin anything. You got scared. That's allowed. Everyone will think I'm crazy. Everyone will think you're human. Margaret, do you want to tell me what happened to you? What made you so afraid?" She'd never told anyone. The words had lived inside her like poison for so long that she'd half convinced herself they'd lost their power. But standing there in the moonlight with this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness, she found that the words wanted out, needed out, before they destroyed her from the inside. "My father," she began, her voice shaking. "After my mother died, he wasn't a kind man. He drank, and when he drank, he got angry. At first it was just yelling, then it was throwing things. Then it was grabbing me, shaking me, telling me I was worthless and stupid and that no one would ever want me." Lucas made a sound low in his throat, pained and angry, but he didn't interrupt. "I learned to be invisible," Margaret continued. "To stay quiet, to not draw attention, to make myself as small as possible. But it was never enough. He'd find reasons to be angry anyway. The dinner was too cold or too hot. The house wasn't clean enough. I'd looked at him wrong. And his hands," her voice broke. "His hands were always so rough, always bruising, always hurting. So when anyone tries to touch me, even kindly, I feel those hands and I panic." "I'm so sorry," Lucas said quietly. "No one should ever have to endure that, especially not from the person who's supposed to protect them. How did you get away?" "I waited until I was 22, until I couldn't be legally forced to return. I saved every penny from selling eggs and butter to neighbors. And one night when he'd passed out drunk, I left. I walked to the nearest town and bought a train ticket as far as my money would take me. That turned out to be Denver. I worked there for a few months, then heard about Platteville needing help at the general store. It seemed small and safe, so I came here." Does he know where you are? I don't think so. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, but I still look over my shoulder everywhere I go, still startle at loud noises, still feel his hands every time someone tries to get close. They stood in silence for a long moment, the music from the town hall floating faintly on the breeze. Finally, Lucas spoke, his voice rough with emotion. My father never hit us, but after my mother died, he withdrew so completely it was like living with a ghost. He stopped talking, stopped eating properly, just sat in his chair and stared at nothing. I tried everything to reach him, but the grief had taken him somewhere I couldn't follow. So I understand, maybe not exactly what you went through, but I understand what it's like to be marked by someone else's pain, to carry wounds that no one can see. Margaret turned to look at him, seeing his face in profile against the starlit sky. How did you heal? Or did you? I'm still healing. Some days are better than others, but I decided that I wouldn't let his grief or my fear of losing people again stop me from living. My mother wouldn't have wanted that. She believed in joy, in connection, in taking risks because the alternative was just existing rather than living. He turned to meet her eyes. You took a risk tonight, Margaret. You danced with me, even though you were terrified. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen anyone do. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and cleansing. I wanted to keep dancing. I wanted to go out on that floor with you and not be afraid. But the moment everyone looked at us, all I could think about was being visible, being seen, and how being seen always led to being hurt. Lucas slowly, telegraphing the movement so she could stop him if she wanted, reached up and wiped away one of her tears with his thumb. Being seen by your father led to being hurt. But Margaret, not everyone is him. Most people, they're just folks trying to get through life as best they can. And in a town like this, they take care of their own. You're one of their own now, whether you plan to be or not. I don't know how to be part of things, I only know how to hide. Then maybe you learn, the same way you learned to dance tonight, one small step at a time. And maybe you let someone help you, someone who understands what it means to be afraid. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the kind gray eyes and the honest face but the scars he carried too, the losses that had shaped him into someone gentle rather than bitter. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me. I'd like to know you if you'd let me. And as for why, maybe because someone was kind to me when I needed it most. Maybe because I see something in you that recognizes something in me. Or maybe, he smiled slightly, because you look beautiful in moonlight and I'm a simple man who appreciates beauty when he finds it. Despite everything, she laughed, a watery sound but genuine. That was a terrible line. It was, wasn't it? I'm better at breaking horses than charming women. His expression grew more serious. But I mean it, all of it. I'd like to spend more time with you, Margaret. Not tonight, not until you're ready. But maybe tomorrow I could come by the store. We could talk, just talk. No dancing, no crowds, just two people getting to know each other. Every instinct told her to refuse, to maintain her safe distance, to protect herself from the possibility of more pain. But something else, something that had awakened during their dance, whispered that maybe safety wasn't the same as healing, that maybe the only way through the fear was straight into it, one small step at a time. Just talking, she said carefully. At the store where Mrs. Henderson will be there. Just talking, he agreed. I'll come by around noon if that works for you. All right. Yes, I'd like that. They walked back toward town together, not touching but close enough that Margaret could feel the warmth of his presence. At the boarding house, Lucas tipped his hat. Thank you for dancing with me tonight. It was the best dance I've had in years. Thank you for teaching me, for being patient, for understanding. Sleep well, Margaret Sutton. I'll see you tomorrow. She watched him walk away, his figure gradually disappearing into the darkness, then climbed the stairs to her room. Inside, she lit her lamp and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back was still wearing the green dress, still had tear tracks on her cheeks, but her eyes held something new. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the possibility of hope, which was more than she'd had in a very long time. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Margaret dressed carefully in her work clothes, a simple gray dress with a white collar, and braided her hair in a practical style. She attended the church service held in the town hall, sitting in the back as usual, but this time when people smiled at her, she tried to smile back instead of looking away. Mrs. Henderson sat beside her and patted her hand during the sermon, a gesture of comfort that Margaret accepted rather than flinching from. After church, she returned to the boarding house for the noon meal, but found she had no appetite. Lucas had said he'd come by the store around noon, but the store was closed on Sundays. Did that mean he'd come to the boarding house? The thought made her nervous, having him in her space, but she also found herself watching the window, waiting. At 12:30, there was a knock on the door downstairs. Mrs. Murphy, who ran the boarding house, called up, "Miss Sutton, you have a caller." Margaret's hands shook as she smoothed her dress and descended the stairs. Lucas waited in the front parlor, hat in hands, looking as nervous as she felt. Mrs. Murphy hovered nearby, clearly curious, but when Lucas politely asked if he might take Miss Sutton for a walk, the older woman nodded approvingly. "Stay where people can see you," she instructed, the standard caution for unmarried young people. And Margaret felt her face heat with embarrassment even though they'd done nothing wrong. Outside, the Sunday quiet wrapped around them. Most people were home with their families, resting after the morning service. Lucas offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret took it. They walked toward the edge of town, toward the path that followed the creek up into the foothills. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," Margaret admitted. "I said I would. I try to keep my word." He glanced at her sideways. "How are you feeling today after last night?" "Embarrassed, confused, a little hopeful, which scares me almost as much as anything else." "Why does hope scare you?" She thought about that as they walked, their feet crunching on the gravel path. "Because I've learned not to trust it. Every time I hoped things would get better with my father, they got worse. Hope feels dangerous, like setting myself up for disappointment." "That's fair," Lucas said. "Hope can be dangerous, but so is despair. At least hope gives you something to move toward." They reached a spot where the creek widened into a small pool, clear water reflecting the blue sky. A fallen log provided a natural bench, and they sat together, watching the water flow past. Margaret felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. Out here, away from watching eyes, she could breathe. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, wanting to know more about him, about the life he'd built in this place. His face lit up. "It's not big, just a few 100 acres, but the land is good. We run cattle mostly, some horses. My brother, he's the real rancher. He can look at a piece of land and know exactly what it needs, which pastures to rotate, where to dig a well. I'm more useful with the animals. I like working with the horses, especially training them." "What's it like, training a horse?" "It's about building trust, same as anything else. You can break a horse through fear, make it obey through pain, but then you just have a broken animal. A good horseman takes the time to understand each horse as an individual, to figure out what motivates them, what scares them, and work with that rather than against it." He picked up a pebble and tossed it into the creek. "My father used to say I had more patience with horses than with people, but I think it's just that horses are honest. They don't hide what they're feeling. If they're scared, they show it. If they trust you, they show that too. People hide what they're feeling because showing it isn't always safe," Margaret said quietly. "I know, and I'm not criticizing that. We all have reasons for our walls." He looked at her directly. "But I'd like to know what you're feeling if you feel safe enough to tell me. Are you all right with being here with me?" The question was so direct, so honest that it caught her off guard. She considered it seriously. "I'm nervous, but it's a different kind of nervous than I'm used to. Not the kind that makes me want to run, exactly. More the kind that comes from doing something new and not knowing how it will turn out. That's good nervous, I think. The kind that means you're growing." They talked for hours, the conversation flowing easily once Margaret relaxed into it. Lucas told her about his childhood in Missouri, about his mother's garden and his father's carpentry work, about the cholera epidemic that had torn through their town and taken so many people they loved. He spoke of the decision to move west, to start over in Colorado where the mountains stood like promises of something better. Margaret found herself sharing too, carefully at first, then with growing confidence. She told him about her mother, a gentle woman who loved birds and kept a journal of every species she spotted. She described the Kansas prairie, the way the grass rolled in waves when the wind blew, the endless sky that made her feel both small and infinite. She even told him about the good memories from before her mother died, when her father had been different, before grief and alcohol had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. "You miss Kansas?" Lucas asked. "I miss who I was there, before everything fell apart. That girl who believed the world was basically good, who trusted easily, who laughed without thinking about it. I don't know if I can ever be her again." "Maybe you don't need to be her again. Maybe you get to be someone new, someone who's been through hard things and survived them. That's not less than who you were before. In some ways, it's more." The sun was starting to sink toward the mountains when they finally walked back toward town. At the boarding house steps, Lucas hesitated. "Would it be all right if I called on you again? Maybe next Sunday if you're free?" "I'd like that," Margaret said and meant it. "But Lucas, I need you to understand something. I don't know if I can be what you might want. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for more than friendship. The thought of courtship, of anything beyond talking, it still terrifies me." "Then we'll just talk," he said simply. "For as long as you need to just talk, that's what we'll do. And if talking is all it ever is, I'll be grateful for your friendship. You don't owe me anything more than you're ready to give, Margaret." The relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her dizzy. "Thank you. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for giving me a chance." He left, and Margaret climbed to her room feeling lighter than she had in months. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write a letter to the one friend she'd had in Kansas, a neighbor girl who'd known about her father's temper and had snuck her food when Margaret had been sent to bed without supper. She hadn't written before, too afraid of leaving a trail, but suddenly she needed to tell someone about Lucas, about dancing, about the possibility of healing. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Margaret worked at the store during the week, growing more comfortable with the customers, even initiating conversations rather than waiting to be spoken to. Mrs. Henderson watched her transformation with obvious pleasure and started leaving her to manage the store alone for hours at a time, a mark of trust that Margaret took seriously. Lucas came by the store several times during the week, always with a reason, needing supplies or picking up an order, but they both knew he was really there to see her. They'd talk while she worked, easy conversations about everything and nothing. He told her about his horses, about the colt he was training that had a stubborn streak a mile wide but also a sweet nature. She told him about the books she was reading, borrowed from Mrs. Henderson's personal library, and about her dream of maybe someday having a small garden like her mother used to tend. On Sundays, after church, they'd walk together, exploring different trails around Platteville. Lucas showed her his favorite spots: a meadow where wildflowers would bloom in another month, a rocky outcrop that provided a view of the entire valley, a stand of aspens that turned gold in autumn. Margaret felt herself slowly unfurling, like a plant that had been kept in darkness finally reaching toward light. One Sunday in early May, 6 weeks after they'd first met, Lucas brought a picnic lunch. They spread a blanket in the wildflower meadow, and Margaret helped unpack the food: fried chicken and biscuits and fresh strawberries that Lucas said came from his brother's wife's garden. "Tell me about your brother," Margaret said, biting into a strawberry. "You mention him often, but I've never met him." "James. He's 2 years older than me, steadier, more serious. After our parents died, he's the one who held everything together, who came up with the plan to move west and start the ranch. I probably would have fallen apart without him." Lucas leaned back on his elbows, face turned toward the sun. "He got married last year to a woman named Sarah. She's from Denver, came out to visit her aunt and ended up staying. They're expecting their first child in the fall. That must be exciting, becoming an uncle." "It is. It also makes me think about the future, about what I want my life to look like." He turned his head to look at her. "I'm 26, Margaret, old enough to know what I want, young enough to still build it. And what I want is land of my own, a house, a family. I want to build something that lasts." Her heart began to race, sensing where this was going. "Lucas, I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "Just telling you what I'm thinking about. I know you're not ready, and that's all right. But I also think you should know that I'm courting you, even if we haven't put that name to it. These Sundays, the conversations, the time we spend together, I'm not doing it just to be friendly. I'm doing it because I care about you, because I think about you when we're apart, because when I imagine that future I want, you're in it." Margaret sat very still, the strawberry forgotten in her hand. Fear and longing warred inside her chest. "I care about you too," she whispered. "But Lucas, I'm so damaged. I don't know if I can be a wife, if I can be intimate with someone, if I can trust enough to build a life with another person. It wouldn't be fair to you to commit to something I might not be able to give. What if we let me decide what's fair to me?" He sat up, turning to face her fully. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to be healed completely before we move forward. I'm just asking you to keep trying, to keep taking small steps, and to let me walk beside you while you do it. What if I can never give you everything a wife should give her husband?" The words came out strangled, her face burning with embarrassment at speaking of such things. "Then we'll figure it out together. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership, two people working through life's challenges side by side. If we have challenges in some areas, we'll work through them with patience and love, the same way we'd work through any other difficulty." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You say that now, but what about in a year? 5 years? What if you wake up one day and resent me for not being what you need?" Lucas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. "Look at me, please." She forced herself to meet his eyes, those steady gray eyes that had shown her nothing but kindness. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, or that everything will always be easy. But I can promise that I see you, the real you, not some imaginary perfect version. I see someone brave and strong who survived things that would have broken a lesser person. I see someone learning to trust again despite every reason not to. And that person, the real Margaret Sutton, is who I'm falling in love with." "Falling in love," she breathed. "Fallen, probably. I think it started that first night when you admitted you were afraid but put your hand in mine anyway." He squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to say anything back. You don't have to feel the same way. I just needed you to know, to understand that this isn't casual for me, that I'm serious about wanting a future with you." Margaret's mind reeled. Love. He loved her. Despite knowing about her past, about her fears, about all the ways she was broken, he loved her. The part of her that was her father's daughter whispered that it was a trick, that no one could truly love someone as damaged as her, that he'd show his true colors eventually. But a newer, stronger part, the part that Lucas had helped nurture over the past weeks, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was real. "I think," she said slowly, testing the words, "I might be falling in love with you too. It terrifies me, but I think it might be true." His smile was like sunrise. Yeah, she laughed, shaky but real. "I've never felt this way before. I didn't know it was possible to be scared and happy at the same time." "That's love," he said. "At least I think it is. Being brave enough to care about someone even though caring makes you vulnerable." They sat together in the meadow as the afternoon wore on, talking about what the future might look like. Lucas didn't push for promises or commitments, but he painted pictures with his words. A small house on a piece of land he'd been saving to buy. A garden for Margaret where she could grow flowers and vegetables. Horses in the pasture and maybe someday children playing in the yard. He made it sound possible, this future, like something they could actually build together. As the sun started to sink, they packed up the picnic and walked back toward town. At the boarding house steps, Lucas hesitated. "Margaret, would you mind if could I kiss your cheek?" "Just your cheek, nothing more, but I'd like to if you're comfortable with it." Her first instinct was to refuse, but she forced herself to think about it rather than just react. A kiss on the cheek was chaste, respectful, the kind of thing courting couples did all the time. And she wanted to say yes to him, wanted to push past the fear just a little further. "All right," she whispered. He stepped closer, moving slowly enough that she could change her mind if she wanted. Then, gentle as a butterfly landing, he pressed his lips to her cheek. The kiss lasted only a second, but it sent warmth spreading through her entire body. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers. "Was that all right?" she nodded, not trusting her voice. He smiled, squeezed her hand once and left. That night, Margaret lay in bed touching her cheek where he'd kissed her, marveling at how such a small gesture could feel so significant. She'd let someone close, let someone touch her affectionately, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, it had expanded, opening up possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. The next month passed in a blur of happiness. Lucas was patient but persistent, courting her properly, bringing her small gifts like wildflowers or a ribbon the color of her eyes. They attended another dance social together, and this time Margaret danced, not just with Lucas but with several other men from town when Lucas encouraged her to accept their invitations. Each dance was easier than the last, and by the end of the evening she was laughing and breathless and more alive than she'd felt in years. Mrs. Henderson watched their courtship with motherly approval and started making knowing comments about wedding plans. Margaret blushed every time but didn't protest. The idea of marrying Lucas had gone from impossible to merely terrifying to something she actually wanted, even if the practicalities still scared her. In mid-June, Lucas invited her to visit the ranch and meet his brother and sister-in-law. Margaret agonized over what to wear, finally settling on her green dress from the first dance. Lucas picked her up in a wagon on Saturday morning, and they drove east out of town toward the grasslands. The ranch house was modest but well built, a simple wooden structure with a porch that wrapped around two sides. Sarah Irving met them at the door, her pregnancy just beginning to show, her smile warm and genuine. "You must be Margaret. Lucas has told us so much about you. Come in, come in." Inside, the house was cozy and clean, with curtains at the windows and a rag rug on the floor. James Irving looked like an older, slightly more weathered version of Lucas, with the same gray eyes and honest face. He shook Margaret's hand firmly. "Good to finally meet you. My brother's been talking about nothing but you for months." "James," Lucas protested, but he was grinning. They had lunch together, simple food but plentiful, and the conversation flowed easily. Sarah asked Margaret about working at the general store, and they discovered a shared love of gardening. James and Lucas discussed ranch business, and Margaret enjoyed listening to them, hearing the easy affection between the brothers, seeing what a healthy family dynamic looked like. After lunch, Lucas showed her around the property. The barn was sturdy and smelled of hay and horses. Lucas led her to a stall where a young colt, probably 3 months old, stood on gangly legs beside his mother. "This is the one I've been telling you about, the stubborn one. I've been working with him every day, getting him used to being handled." Margaret watched as Lucas entered the stall, his movements calm and confident. The colt whickered nervously, but Lucas just stood still, letting the animal approach him rather than forcing contact. When the colt finally stepped forward to sniff his hand, Lucas rewarded him with patient strokes along his neck. "See, he just needed to learn that I'm not a threat, that touching can be gentle." Margaret understood he was talking about more than just the horse. She'd been like that colt, nervous and skittish, learning slowly that not all touch was harmful. "You're good with him." "I try. Every animal is different, just like every person. You have to learn what each one needs." They walked further to a spot on a small rise where the land opened up in all directions. Lucas pointed to the south. "That property there, about 50 acres, it's for sale. I've been saving to buy it. The house needs work, but it has good bones. There's a creek that runs through one corner and the soil is decent for a garden." "Are you going to buy it?" Margaret asked, her heart beating faster. "I'd like to. If I had a reason to. If I knew I was building a home rather than just a house." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Margaret Sutton, I know we've only known each other a few months. I know you're still healing, still learning to trust. But I also know that I love you and I want to spend my life with you. Would you consider marrying me?" Her breath caught in her throat. They'd talked around this, circled it, but hearing the actual question was different. "Lucas, I want to say yes, but I need you to understand what you'd be getting. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still panic if someone moves too fast or speaks too loudly. And the thought of being intimate, it still scares me so much I can barely think about it. A wife is supposed to give her husband certain things, and I don't know if I can. Let me worry about what I need from a wife," he said firmly. "Margaret, I'm not some saint who's never thought about the physical side of marriage. Of course, I have. But I'm also not some brute who thinks that's all marriage is about. We'll figure it out together at your pace, with your comfort always coming first. And if it takes months or years for you to feel safe enough for intimacy, then it takes months or years. I'm not going anywhere. What if I'm never ready? Then we'll have a marriage based on partnership and companionship and love, and that will be enough because you're enough, Margaret. Just as you are." She searched his face for any sign of doubt or hidden resentment but found only sincerity. "You really mean that? Every word. So I'll ask again. Will you marry me?" Joy and terror warred in her chest, but for the first time in her life joy won. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." His whoop of happiness startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree. He picked her up and spun her around, then set her down quickly, apologizing. "I'm sorry. I should have asked first." But Margaret was laughing, truly laughing, her arms still around his neck from where she'd grabbed him during the spin. "It's all right. You surprised me, but it's all right. Can I kiss you? Really kiss you, not just your cheek?" Fear flickered, but she pushed through it. "Yes, but gently. And if I need you to stop, then I stop immediately. No questions, no pressure." He cupped her face in his hands, his touch feather-light, giving her every opportunity to pull away. "Tell me if this is too much." Then his lips met hers, soft and sweet and patient. Margaret's first instinct was panic, the feeling of being trapped, but Lucas wasn't trapping her. His touch was gentle, and she could pull away any time she wanted. She forced herself to relax into the kiss, to let herself feel the warmth of it rather than the fear. When they parted, she was shaking but smiling. "Was that all right?" he asked, concern in his eyes. "It was nice. I was scared, but it was nice." "We'll practice," he promised. "As much or as little as you want until it stops being scary and becomes just nice." They returned to the ranch house hand in hand to share the news. Sarah squealed with delight and immediately began talking about wedding plans. James shook Lucas's hand with a grin. "About time. I was starting to think you'd never get around to asking." "I wanted to make sure she was ready," Lucas replied, looking at Margaret with such love that she felt her chest might burst. Over cake and coffee, they discussed practical matters. Margaret wanted a small wedding, just close friends and family at the church in Platteville. Lucas agreed immediately. They set the date for August, giving them 2 months to prepare. Sarah offered to help Margaret with her dress, and Mrs. Henderson, when they told her the next day, insisted on throwing an engagement party. The engagement party was held 2 weeks later at the town hall. It seemed like the whole town turned out, bringing gifts and good wishes. Margaret, who'd once hidden from attention, found herself in the center of it all and discovered that it wasn't as terrifying as she'd expected. These people were genuinely happy for them, and their joy was infectious. Lucas stayed by her side the whole evening, a steady presence whenever she felt overwhelmed. They danced 3 times, and each time Margaret felt more confident, more comfortable in his arms. Mrs. Chen pulled her aside at one point and pressed a small package into her hands. "For your wedding night, dear. Tea that will help with nerves." Margaret's face burned, but she thanked the older woman. Everyone seemed to assume that the wedding night would proceed normally, that Margaret would fulfill all the expected duties of a wife. The thought filled her with dread, but Lucas had said they'd go at her pace, and she chose to believe him. The weeks before the wedding flew by in a flurry of preparations. Margaret gave notice at the general store, though Mrs. Henderson insisted she could return to work whenever she wanted, that married women were certainly capable of running stores. Lucas spent his days working on the small house he'd bought, repairing the roof and fixing the windows and building furniture for their rooms. Margaret helped when she could, painting walls and sewing curtains, turning the empty house into a home. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the unfinished house watching the sunset, Margaret worked up the courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Lucas, about the wedding night, I've been thinking. We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said immediately. "I meant what I said. I know. But I also know that marriage includes certain expectations, and I want to try. I want to be a proper wife to you. I just need you to be patient if I panic, if I need to stop." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We'll go as slow as you need. And Margaret, there's no such thing as a proper wife. There's just you and me figuring out our life together. Whatever that looks like is the right way for us." His words eased some of her anxiety, though not all of it. She'd borrowed a book from Sarah, a married woman's guide that was supposed to explain the mechanics of intimacy. Reading it had left her more confused than enlightened, the clinical descriptions doing nothing to help her understand how something that sounded so awkward could also be the foundation of a loving marriage. But she trusted Lucas, and that trust was going to have to be enough. The wedding day arrived in a blur of August heat and nervous energy. Sarah helped her dress in the small house where Margaret had sewn her wedding gown, a simple white dress with lace at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers, made with her own hands, and she felt beautiful in it. Mrs. Henderson arrived with flowers for her hair, wild flowers from the meadow where Lucas had first told her he loved her. "You look radiant, dear. Lucas is a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Margaret murmured, and meant it. The ceremony was held in the church at 4 in the afternoon. Lucas stood at the front in his best suit, his brother beside him as best man. When Margaret walked down the aisle, his face lit up with such love and happiness that her nervousness faded. This was Lucas, her Lucas, who'd shown her nothing but patience and kindness. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. The vows were traditional, and Margaret's voice shook only slightly as she promised to love and honor him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas kissed her gently, respectfully, mindful of the watching crowd. Then they were walking back down the aisle together, married, bound together by promises and hope and love. The reception was held in the town hall, with food and music and dancing. Margaret danced with her husband, with James, with several men from town, feeling almost normal, almost like the fears that had defined her for so long were finally loosening their grip. As the evening wore on, she found herself actually enjoying the attention, the celebration, the sense of community that wrapped around them like a warm blanket. As midnight approached, Sarah pulled her aside. "It's customary for the bride and groom to leave for their wedding night. Everyone will understand." Margaret's stomach clenched with anxiety, but she nodded. She found Lucas talking with some ranchers and touched his arm. He turned immediately, reading her expression. "Ready to go home. Home. They're home." She nodded, and he made their excuses to the gathering. People cheered and called out good-natured advice as they left, making Margaret blush furiously. But Lucas just kept his hand at her back, steady and reassuring, as they walked through the warm night toward the small house that was now theirs. Inside, Lucas had lit lamps that cast a soft glow through the rooms. Their bedroom was simple, furnished with a bed he'd built himself, a dresser, and a washstand. He'd put wildflowers in a vase on the dresser, a thoughtful touch that made Margaret's eyes sting with tears. "If you want, you can change in here and I'll change in the other room," Lucas offered. "Take your time. No rush." Margaret had prepared a nightgown, another simple white garment with buttons at the neck. Her hands shook as she changed out of her wedding dress, carefully hanging it in the wardrobe. She brushed out her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders, and stared at herself in the small mirror. She looked young and scared and determined all at once. When she opened the door, Lucas was waiting in the main room, wearing sleep clothes, his hair damp as if he'd washed. He looked at her with such tenderness that some of her fear eased. "You're beautiful," he said quietly. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But also I want to try. I want to be close to you even though I'm scared. Come here." She crossed to him, and he took her hands, leading her to sit on the edge of their bed. "We're going to take this as slow as you need. At any point, if you want to stop, we stop. If you need to talk, we talk. If you need space, I'll give you space. This isn't about me taking something from you. It's about us learning to be close, to trust each other with this part of our lives too." "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "Neither do I, not really. I'm not experienced in this either. We'll figure it out together." He cupped her face gently. "Can I kiss you?" She nodded, and he kissed her, slow and sweet. Margaret tried to relax into it, to focus on the warmth of his lips rather than the panic fluttering in her chest. When his hand moved to her waist, she stiffened, and he immediately pulled back. "Too much. Just surprised me. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. Let's try again, and I'll move slower." They spent what felt like hours just kissing, with Lucas gradually adding small touches to her waist, her back, her arms, always telegraphing the movement, always giving her time to adjust. Margaret's fear slowly gave way to curiosity, and then to a warmth that started low in her belly and spread outward. When Lucas's fingers found the buttons at her neck, she froze. "You want me to stop?" he asked immediately. "No, I mean I'm scared, but I don't want to stop. I just need you to keep going slow as you need." He unbuttoned the nightgown with patient fingers, never rushing, pressing kisses to her temple, her cheek, her jaw. When the fabric slipped from her shoulders, Margaret fought the urge to cover herself, to hide. Lucas looked at her with such reverence, such clear desire tempered by love, that she managed to stay still. "You're so beautiful," he breathed. "Can I touch you?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. His hands were gentle, exploring with care, and though fear still hummed beneath her skin, it was distant now, overshadowed by new sensations that she didn't have names for. When his weight settled over her, she tensed, memories of being pinned, being helpless, flooding back. "Margaret, stay with me," Lucas said, his voice firm but kind. "You're safe. I've got you. You can tell me to stop any time." "Don't stop," she managed. "I'm all right. Keep going." He did, with a patience that should have been impossible, checking in with her constantly, adjusting when she winced, praising her when she relaxed. The joining itself hurt, a sharp pain that made her gasp, but Lucas stilled immediately. "Do you need me to stop?" "No. Sarah said it hurts the first time, that it gets better. I'm so sorry. I don't want to hurt you." "You're not hurting me, not really. This is different. I chose this. I want this. Please, Lucas, I want to finish this." He moved again, carefully, and gradually the pain faded to discomfort, and then to something that wasn't quite pleasure but wasn't unpleasant either. When it was over, Lucas held her close, stroking her hair, murmuring praise and love against her temple. "You were so brave, so strong." "I love you so much." Margaret clung to him, shaking with reaction and relief and the overwhelming realization that she'd done it. She'd been intimate with her husband and survived, had even chosen it, wanted it. "I love you too," she whispered. "Thank you for being patient with me. Always. For as long as you need." They lay together in the darkness, talking quietly until Margaret's eyes grew heavy. She fell asleep in her husband's arms, safe and warm and loved, and for the first time in years, she didn't have nightmares. The months that followed were an adjustment, learning to live together, to share space and decisions and a life. Margaret had moments of panic, times when old fears resurfaced without warning, but Lucas never wavered in his patience and support. Their intimacy grew easier with time and practice, the fear gradually replaced by pleasure and connection, and Margaret marveled at how her body, which she'd learned to see as a source of pain, could also be a source of joy. In late October, James and Sarah's baby arrived, a healthy boy they named Henry. Margaret visited often, helping Sarah with the newborn and learning the rhythms of infant care. Holding little Henry, seeing the love between the small family, Margaret felt a longing she'd never expected, a desire for a child of her own. That winter, she suspected she might be pregnant. When the doctor confirmed it in January of 1883, she felt equal parts terror and joy. Lucas was overjoyed, already planning improvements to the house, a proper nursery and a larger kitchen. Margaret tried to share his excitement, but old fears whispered that she'd be a terrible mother, that she'd damage her child the way her father had damaged her. One evening, as they sat by the fire with Margaret's hand resting on her still flat belly, she voiced her fears. "What if I'm like him, Lucas? What if I hurt our child?" "You won't be," he said firmly. "You know what it feels like to be hurt by a parent. That knowledge will make you more careful, more aware, not less. And Margaret, you're one of the gentlest people I know. Look at how you are with Henry, with the children who come into the store. You're patient and kind and loving. Our child is lucky to have you as a mother." His confidence helped, but Margaret still worried throughout the pregnancy. She read everything she could find about child rearing, determined to be prepared. Sarah was a wealth of practical advice, and Mrs. Henderson knitted tiny clothes and blankets with enthusiasm. In early September, after a long labor that left Margaret exhausted and swearing she'd never do this again, their son was born. He was red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn gray like his father's. They named him Thomas, after Lucas's father, with the middle name William after Margaret's grandfather. Holding Thomas for the first time, feeling his tiny weight in her arms, Margaret felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. This child, this miracle, was hers to protect and nurture and love. She would never let him feel afraid in his own home, never let him question his worth, never let him carry the scars she'd carried. Lucas was a devoted father, waking for nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, rocking Thomas for hours when he was fussy. Watching her husband with their son, Margaret felt her love for him deepen in ways she hadn't known were possible. He was everything her father hadn't been, gentle and patient and present, and their home was filled with laughter rather than fear. The years passed in a rhythm of work and love and growing. Thomas learned to walk, then to talk, chattering constantly and following his father around the ranch on sturdy toddler legs. When he was 3, Margaret became pregnant again, and this time her fears were quieter, overshadowed by the confidence that came from having successfully raised one child already. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1886, a tiny thing with Margaret's brown eyes and Lucas's smile. They named her Grace, and she was quieter than Thomas had been, a serious baby who watched everything with solemn attention before suddenly breaking into smiles that lit up the room. Margaret had never imagined she could be this happy, had never dared to hope for a life so full of love and peace. On quiet evenings, with the children asleep and Lucas's arm around her shoulders, she'd think back to that scared woman who'd arrived in Platteville 4 years earlier, convinced she was too broken to ever heal. That woman had found the courage to put her hand in a cowboy's hand and learn to dance, to trust, to love, and in doing so had built a life more beautiful than any she'd ever imagined possible. Lucas would sometimes ask her to dance with him in their kitchen, humming a waltz they'd first learned at that social in Platteville. And Margaret, who'd once said she couldn't dance, would step into her husband's arms and let the music carry them, moving together in perfect rhythm, two people who'd found healing in each other's love. By the time Thomas was 10 and Grace was 7, the small ranch had grown into a prosperous operation. Lucas had bought more land, and they ran 100 head of cattle along with the horses he still loved to train. Margaret had her garden, sprawling and abundant, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for her house. She'd even started selling her excess produce in town, building a small business of her own. The children were healthy and happy, growing up knowing they were loved without condition. Thomas showed his father's way with horses, spending every spare moment in the barn, while Grace had inherited Margaret's careful patience and loved helping in the garden. They bickered like all siblings did, but underneath was a deep bond, a security that came from knowing they were safe and cherished. One evening in late summer, as they all sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas asked, "Papa, how did you and Mama meet?" Lucas smiled at Margaret over the children's heads. "Well, your mother worked at the general store and I came in to buy supplies. She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, but also the shyest. I asked her to dance at the town social, but she said she didn't know how. So what happened?" Grace demanded. "I taught her," Lucas said simply. I told her that dancing wasn't as hard as it seemed, that it was just about trusting your partner and moving together. And your mother, even though she was scared, she was brave enough to try. Was Mama a good dancer? Thomas wanted to know. Margaret laughed. I was terrible at first. I stepped on your father's feet more times than I can count, but he was patient with me and eventually I learned. The dancing part anyway. What else did you learn? Grace asked, perceptive as always. Margaret met Lucas's eyes, seeing the love and pride there, the shared knowledge of how far they'd come. I learned that being scared doesn't mean you can't do something. I learned that some people are worth trusting, even when trust feels impossible. And I learned that the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be loved. That night, after the children were asleep, Lucas pulled Margaret into his arms in their bedroom. Do you ever regret it, saying yes to me, even though you were so scared? Never, she said without hesitation. You saved my life, Lucas Irving. Not by rescuing me, but by showing me I was worth saving, that I deserved love and happiness and a future. Everything good in my life comes from that first moment when I put my hand in yours. You saved me too, he murmured against her hair. I was so lost after my parents died, just going through the motions of living. You reminded me what it meant to really live, to fight for something, to build something beautiful out of broken pieces. They made love that night with the easy familiarity of long partnership. The fear and hesitation of their early days long since replaced by pleasure and deep connection. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret thought about that shy woman who'd said she couldn't dance, who'd been so broken she thought she'd never heal. That woman had learned to dance, had learned to trust, had learned to love and be loved. She'd built a life that honored her mother's memory and broke the cycle of her father's violence. She'd raised children who knew only kindness, who'd never know what it meant to be afraid in their own home. She'd healed, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. More than enough. The years continued to unfold in their gentle rhythm. Margaret stayed involved in the community, helping Mrs. Henderson at the store a few days a week, organizing socials and fundraisers, becoming the kind of person she'd once been too afraid to be around. Lucas expanded the ranch further, taking on hired hands and becoming known throughout the county for the quality of his horses. Thomas grew into a fine young man, responsible and hardworking like his father, gentle and thoughtful like his mother. When he was 18, he began courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited girl named Anna who made him laugh and challenged him in equal measure. Watching them together, Margaret saw the same patient courtship she and Lucas had shared, and she knew her son had learned from his father what it meant to treat a woman with respect and love. Grace was quieter, more studious, with dreams of becoming a teacher. She spent hours with books, learning everything she could, and Margaret encouraged her, wanting her daughter to have opportunities she herself had never had. Grace would make her own way in the world, confident and strong, never doubting her worth. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Lucas surprised Margaret with a trip to Denver. They stayed in a hotel, went to the theater, walked through gardens that made Margaret's heart sing with their beauty. On the last evening, as they danced in the hotel ballroom, Lucas pulled her close. "Do you remember that first dance?" he asked. "When you were so scared you were shaking." "I remember everything about that night. I remember your kindness, your patience, the way you made me feel safe enough to try. You've come so far. Look at you now, dancing in a ballroom in Denver, confident and beautiful and completely comfortable in my arms." "That's because of you," she said. "You taught me it was safe to be close to someone, that touch could be gentle, that love didn't have to hurt." "We taught each other," he corrected. "You taught me that love was worth the risk, that building a life with someone could be beautiful even when it was hard, that patience and kindness mattered more than anything else. They danced until the music stopped, then returned to their room where they made love with the passion of newlyweds and the skill of long practice. 25 years of marriage, of partnership, of growing together rather than apart. And Margaret still thanked God every day for the cowboy who'd taken her hand and taught her to trust. Thomas married Anna when he was 20, in a ceremony that reminded Margaret and Lucas of their own wedding, simple and heartfelt. The young couple built a house on a corner of the ranch, and within a year, Margaret and Lucas became grandparents to a baby girl named Rose. Holding her granddaughter, seeing the continuation of the family she and Lucas had built, Margaret felt a completeness that brought tears to her eyes. Grace went to Teachers College in Denver, determined and focused, and graduated with honors. She returned to Platteville to teach at the small schoolhouse, inspiring her students the way Mrs. Henderson had once inspired Margaret. She was courted by several young men, but Grace took her time, waiting for someone who understood her mind as well as her heart. As Margaret and Lucas entered their 50s, they slowed down some, leaving more of the ranch work to Thomas and the hired hands. Lucas still trained horses, but he was selective now, taking on only the most interesting challenges. Margaret tended her garden and spent long hours with her grandchildren, teaching Rose to plant seeds and pull weeds, watching the little girl grow. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Lucas took Margaret's hand. "I've been thinking about that first night I taught you to dance." "You think about that a lot," Margaret teased gently, "because it was the beginning of everything. The moment you put your hand in mine, even though you were terrified, that was when I knew you were the strongest person I'd ever met, and every day since has proven me right. I wasn't strong. I was broken and scared. You were broken and scared and still brave enough to try. That's what strength is, Margaret, not the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward despite it." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him still steady after all these years. "I love you, Lucas Irving. Thank you for teaching me to dance. Thank you for letting me. Thank you for building this life with me, for giving me children and grandchildren, for making every day an adventure. You're still the best dance partner I've ever had." They sat together as the stars began to emerge, two people who'd found each other in the midst of their brokenness and built something beautiful together. The ranch spread out around them, the house filled with memories, the family they'd created thriving and growing. Grace eventually married a quiet man named Daniel who loved books as much as she did, and they had 2 children who Lucas swore had Margaret's thoughtfulness and determination. Thomas and Anna had 3 more children, filling the ranch with laughter and chaos and joy. As Margaret moved into her 60s, her health remained good, her mind sharp, her heart full. She still danced with Lucas at every opportunity, whether in the kitchen to music only they could hear, or at town socials where they were now among the older couples, teaching the young ones the steps they'd perfected over decades of partnership. She'd long since stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped flinching at sudden movements or loud voices. The scars from her childhood remained, but they'd faded to distant memories rather than open wounds. She'd proven her father wrong in every way that mattered. She wasn't worthless or stupid or unlovable. She was cherished and respected and surrounded by a family who adored her. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that took over the entire town hall. Everyone from Platteville came, along with friends from neighboring ranches and towns, to celebrate the couple who'd become pillars of their community. There was music and dancing and food, stories told and memories shared, and through it all, Lucas never left Margaret's side. When they danced together that night, moving in perfect synchronization after 4 decades of practice, Margaret felt herself transported back to that first terrified attempt in the corner of this very room. She'd been so scared, so convinced she couldn't do it, and Lucas had been so patient, so kind, so certain that she could. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas murmured as they swayed to a slow waltz. "About how far we've come. About that shy woman who said she couldn't dance and the cowboy who taught her she could. About everything we've built together. No regrets, not a single one. You, only that I didn't find you sooner, that we didn't have even more years together." "We have time yet," she assured him. "And however much time we get, it's enough because we spent it together." They danced until the music stopped, then stood wrapped in each other's arms as their family and friends applauded. Looking around the room at all the lives they'd touched, all the love they'd nurtured and spread, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. She'd survived her father's cruelty, had traveled across the country alone, had found work and safety in a small Colorado town, and had been brave enough to accept the hand of a cowboy who'd promised to teach her to dance. That decision, that one moment of courage, had led to everything good in her life. A loving marriage, beautiful children, precious grandchildren, a community that valued and respected her, and decades of happiness she'd never dared to dream possible. As they left the party that night, walking hand in hand toward the ranch that had been home for so many years, Margaret looked up at the stars scattered across the vast Colorado sky. "Thank you," she whispered to the universe, to fate, to whatever force had brought her to Platteville and into Lucas Irving's life. "Thank you for teaching me that I deserved to be loved, that I was strong enough to heal, that saying yes to love was the bravest thing I could do." Lucas squeezed her hand, and she knew he understood, the way he always understood. They walked together in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned each other so thoroughly that words were often unnecessary. Their house waited ahead, warm with lamplight, filled with memories of a lifetime of love. And in the quiet of their bedroom, as they held each other close after so many years of holding each other close, Margaret thought again of that first dance. The shy woman who said she couldn't dance had learned so much more than just steps and rhythm. She'd learned to trust, to love, to believe in her own worth and strength. She'd learned that healing was possible, that happiness could be built even on the foundation of pain, that courage came in small moments as much as grand gestures. She'd learned to dance, and in learning to dance, she'd learned to live fully, to love deeply, to trust completely. And that shy cowboy who'd taken her hand with such patience and kindness had been her partner in every step of the journey, never pushing, always supporting, loving her through every fear and every triumph. As sleep claimed her in the safety of her husband's arms, Margaret's last conscious thought was one of profound peace. She'd lived a good life, a beautiful life, a life worth fighting for. And it had all begun with a simple invitation to dance and the courage to say yes. The years that remained to them were gentle, filled with the quiet joys of watching their family grow and prosper. Lucas passed first, in his sleep at the age of 78, and Margaret grieved deeply but without despair. They'd had more than 50 years together, building a love that had sustained them both through every challenge. She'd held his hand at the end, thanking him for every dance, every kindness, every moment of their shared life. Margaret lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. She told them stories of the old days, of arriving in Platteville scared and alone, of the cowboy who taught her to dance, of building a life from broken pieces into something whole and beautiful. When she passed peacefully in her sleep at 83, the whole community mourned. The church was full for her funeral, packed with people whose lives she'd touched, whose children she'd taught to garden, whose hearts she'd warmed with her gentle kindness and hard-won wisdom. They buried her beside Lucas on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, with the mountains rising in the distance and the prairie grass waving in the breeze. And though she was gone, her legacy lived on in the children and grandchildren who carried her strength and Lucas's kindness into the future, in the community she'd helped build, in the lives she'd touched simply by being brave enough to heal. The story of the shy woman who couldn't dance and the cowboy who taught her to trust became family legend, passed down through generations. It was a story about courage and healing, about love that was patient and kind, about the truth that broken things could be made beautiful again with time and care and the right person by your side. And somewhere in the summer evening breeze that whispered through the Colorado mountains, in the music that played at wedding dances and town socials, in the gentle touch of lovers learning to trust each other, the spirit of that first dance lived on. A testament to the truth that saying yes to love, even when you're terrified, even when you're broken, even when you're certain you can't, is always, always worth it in the end.